criminal activity, we try to hold them in custody, and we try to get a deportation order on them rather than let them return voluntarily to their country. Because once you get a deportation order on somebody, if they come back, they're facing 20 years in prison. And the third level of enforcement was people who had been deported and came back, or people who were engaged in crimes like smuggling, harboring, transporting, false claim to citizenship, which were all felonies. And we would prosecute those in U.S. District Court. And at some point in time, we had more cases in U.S. District Court than every other federal agency combined, because we had a very high volume of people, particularly reentry cases. The last reentry I worked, the guy got 151 months to serve. And ironically, he was part of that operation from Illinois. He had come in. He was a Kosovar who'd been smuggled in. He'd been deported. He had a really bad record. When we arrested him, he had a pretty good quantity of cocaine. It was his fourth trafficking conviction, and he got sentenced as a career criminal. And this went on all the time. I thought we did a very effective job. Unfortunately, thanks to certain people in the political sphere, that cooperation stopped. And I'm not going to blame this administration or the last administration for the decrease in immigration enforcement. The problem started under the Carter administration when we got a commissioner named Leonel Castillo. He brought a new attitude into immigration, and it wasn't a good one. And it just deteriorated from there. It alternated between administrations being hostile to immigration enforcement and what you'd call benign neglect. It didn't get much better than that. So I would say the last administration was benign neglect, and this administration seems somewhat hostile.
We've got a question from one of our recurring contributors, Dave Fisher, who I sometimes call our ambassador from Woonsocket, mayoral candidate there, political progressive, and regular contributor to the coalition, asks, how is the illegal immigration problem exacerbated in the U.S. by foreign policy decisions, including the war on drugs? And then he asked, and this is something I'd wanted to ask, shouldn't enforcement focus on employers who hire undocumented workers?
Well, they do. They do go after employees. There was the case out in was it New Bedford, where they arrested over something like 360 aliens. But what people don't realize is they pursued criminal case against the employer, and they got convictions. The way the law is written, unfortunately, it's hard to get.
Do you remember what the sentence was on the convictions?
I don't remember. I mean, I was retired for quite a while at the time. We have we were supposed to, when on the last amnesty, 1986, 28 years ago, there was supposed to be enhanced enforcement against employers, but it was watered down. There were a lot of problems with that amnesty. I don't think we have the time to go into it now, but the amnesty started out with a pretty good premise, and it wound up with just some really terrible amendments that were added by Panetta, by Kennedy, by Schumer, and Schumer's still in Congress, and they basically ruined that amnesty program in '86.
Well, I wanted to ask about the whole amnesty issue, pre-amnesty and post-amnesty. Clearly, anecdotally, as not someone who is not an expert, I believe we've seen an exponential increase in illegal immigration post-amnesty. What does that speak to, then, the potential for us all of a sudden being able to control it if we have a new amnesty?
Well, we won't, and I'll tell you why. What happened after the last amnesty is 2 or 3 million people who were legalized. You know what? They weren't going to be abused anymore. They weren't going to be paid substandard wages, and they weren't going to work in substandard conditions. So the same employers that had been hiring them turned around and got new people.
Right.
It just perpetuated the same problem. The only way to really deal with it is to put an E-Verify across the board and have severe criminal penalties for employers who hire these people. Because what it comes down to is they call smugglers, the smugglers deliver the people to them. And, we don't have a lot of agriculture here in Rhode Island. But
no, but that is one of the key magnets for immigrants.
Right, yeah. You get states with like in Illinois, we did have a lot of agriculture, especially downstate, and they would just deliver people there by the truckload. When I was in the anti-smuggling squad, I was never home. I would go through 8 or 9 weeks without a day off because it just wouldn't stop. It was like working in the post office, except you had people being sent.
Well, we don't have much agriculture, but one industry that is thriving in New England to a large degree is landscaping. Similar talent pool, similar skills, similar results. And particularly, amongst a handful of communities, that seems to be a significant draw into New England.
We never dealt too much with landscapers that I recall. I'll tell you, we didn't have a big office here. When I got here, we only had 3 agents, and we were using about 90% of our time on criminal aliens. We had to prioritize. And, excuse me, what we were doing was going to the probation and parole office and going through their records by hand and pulling records of people who claim they were born abroad. And if you claim you're born abroad, then it's up to you to prove you're here legally. The burden is on you. See, what people don't understand is deportation law itself is a civil proceeding. Okay, even though you may be locked up. It's not a criminal charge. So you don't have the same rights that you would in a criminal case. But let's say you're deported and then you come back illegally, then that's a felony. Then the same rights attached to you that would attach to any bank robber.
How significant is it that our current elected leadership on both sides of the aisle don't look to post-deportation illegal immigration as a true criminal act?
They do. I mean, they've increased the penalties from 2 years to 20 years.
Yet at the same time, there seems to be, from the highest levels of our federal government, a Justice Department-driven failure to actively enforce.
I don't know about today. I know when I'll say one thing for the Rhode Island District Court and the U.S. attorneys in Rhode Island were unfailingly vigorous in pursuing reentry cases. That may have changed. I've been out so long, I don't really know.
Well,
it's not like I have contact with the agency today.
The last I'd heard, there was a fairly steady pace of people being deported.
Well, deported, but we're talking about reentry. Reentry is a serious offense. I understand that the deportation figures are not accurate because what this administration admits doing is bumping them up by using the turnarounds at the border. The deportations from the interior of the United States are probably not up because you see less and less. You're
saying people who were stopped at the border and escorted immediately right back over the border.
Yeah, there's 2 ways to leave the United States. You can get a voluntary departure where you pay your way back and it's not considered deportation, or you can go to a hearing and you can receive an order of deportation from a judge. It's a judicial proceeding. You can't, just because I put a guy on a bus, he signs a form that he's going back voluntarily. He hasn't been deported. He's been returned voluntarily. But if I send him up to a hearing and the immigration judge says, okay, now you're deported, that's a formal proceeding. They take his prints. They put the print on the deportation warrant. If he comes back, they compare the print. And basically, it's about 100% chance of being convicted.
You touched on E-Verify.
Right.
It seems like E-Verify, unfortunately, its shelf life seems to be over in Rhode Island. Thanks to Dan Connors and a parliamentary move on the day that it might have actually finally passed, seems to have been put on the back burner. Do you see any future for E-Verify in Rhode Island?
Well, it has to be imposed at a federal level. You can't have every state piecemealing E-Verify. Mm-hmm. It's basically, the Constitution refers to naturalization of aliens by the federal government. So naturalization presupposes that you're going to have jurisdiction on them when they're not citizens too. And so it is a federal function, and the federal government has been absent. They have to make E-Verify a nationwide uniform system. And that's the only thing that's going to work.
There are so many misconceptions about E-Verify. Clear up one or two of the biggest ones, if you could.
I'll try, yeah.
I mean, the whole notion that it's a incomplete, unsupported system that routinely fails. Is that true?
I don't think so. It uses the Social Security database, and that's a pretty good database. You don't hear a lot of complaints about people putting in for Social Security and they can't find their records. That may have been true 40 years ago. Right. I know that the only people who are going to run into problems with E-Verify would be, let's say, a woman who didn't change to her married name with her Social Security account. But that's easily cleared up. Actually, the people who would suffer the least are immigrants or naturalized citizens, because they have an A number that's issued by the government when they come into the United States. And they can go to the CIS data system and verify who they are within minutes.
So ironically, the system that has become the bogeyman by those supporting legal or illegal immigration could in fact help employ some of the very people that they think it'll hurt.
Well, they don't really think it'll hurt. It's a ploy by the people who are activists on behalf of deportable aliens are the ones that are saying that the system is inaccurate, because they don't really want people to be kept from the jobs. They don't want people to be discovered. They have a political reason for it, I would imagine. It's not a good thing, though. No country in the world can exist without controlling immigration to some degree. You can't have an open borders philosophy.
We've only got 3 or 4 minutes left, and I guess the measure to me of a good show is that if we were 2 hours, we could go on for another hour. So we have something what we call a lightning round. So in the remaining 3 or 4 minutes, I'm going to throw out a couple names, and I just want a brief but literal, visceral reaction to it. Sheldon Whitehouse.
He was probably the worst U.S. attorney I ever encountered, and I worked with U.S. attorneys' offices in many different states: Illinois, Massachusetts, New York, Fort Worth, Texas, Florida, California, at one time or another. And Lincoln Almond was a terrific U.S. attorney, and I just can't say enough about Sheldon Whitehouse as far as running the office poorly.
Wow.
But he did prosecute immigration cases.
Selectively.
Yeah.
Teddy Kennedy.
Teddy Kennedy ruined the last amnesty by setting up something called the wall of confidentiality, so that if somebody was turned down because they were a criminal by the legalization branch, they couldn't notify the enforcement branch that they had a criminal who was ineligible for amnesty. So they had to let him go, and we could never see that file. We could go through a citizen's file or a resident alien's file, but somebody who wanted amnesty, they were treated like they were in a confessional with a priest.
David Cicilline.
I really don't want to speak about him at all. He absolutely ruined. Well, he went from being a lawyer who represented illegal alien drug dealers to being the mayor. So you know what happened to the liaison with the police department between him and Esserman.
Wow. Last one. We'll throw this one out. Rudy Giuliani.
I don't know enough about him.
Okay.
Really, I didn't live in. I remember when he was in the Justice Department. I thought he was one of the better people there. But I know very little about him.
Who's going to be the next governor of Rhode Island?
I have no idea. I'll tell you what, it looks like a real free-for-all right now. Maybe the Prius.
Maybe the Prius. Wow.
It has its own Twitter account. Right?
Well, Tony, I don't know what to say after that. Well, listen, thank you again for being on the show. We've got some big changes to the show coming up. We're going to have you on again, particularly as we get into election season, because this issue needs to resurface, and it needs to resurface as a debatable issue in the context of who's going to be our next governor and who's going to be our next attorney general. It's that important.
Chris P.O., great job as always. Joe, thank you for coming in.
Oh, you're welcome.
Facebook.com/The Coalition Radio. On Twitter @Coalition_radio. And of course, don't forget to check out coalitionradio.us. Best of podcasts. We have blog content. You can send hate mail to the PO taxpayer. We've got it all.
He loves it. He loves it.
coalitionradio.us. As always, thank you all for tuning in to The Coalition.